Welcome to Mindful AI, the podcast where we explore how to create AI that is beneficial to humanity, ethical, and promotes human values and flourishing. In this episode, we're joined by Kirk Mitchell from Google, a geospatial leader working at the intersection of AI, mapping, and sustainability. We talk about why grounding AI in real-world geographic data may be one of the keys to reducing hallucinations, and how geospatial AI can support human rights through things as fundamental as giving people an address. We also explore AI for climate impact, safer cities, autonomous vehicles, and the deeper question of what we should never outsource to machines. If you find this episode insightful, please subscribe to Mindful AI and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us bring more of these important and meaningful conversations to you and others.
All right. So welcome back, everyone, to Mindful AI podcast, where we advocate for human values in AI. So today we have the honor to speak with Kirk Mitchell. And Kirk, I'd like to get straight into how we connected. So it's been a couple of years. We were running for the Tech Diversity Awards with the Mindful CIO community, and I reached out to you on LinkedIn because you were one of the judges. And I was excited and thought maybe I would meet you, in person at the event. And you said, sorry, Ned, I'll be in Japan. Since then, we spoke a couple of times, and finally we managed to get you here. So it's great to have you. So thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. And I love the fact you referred to Tech Diversity Awards. It's something I'm super passionate about as well, like yourself. So that exists in our country and that we continue to support that. It's really great as an initiative there, for sure.
Yes. And as I was doing my research in preparation for our conversation today, I found out one video of you and two other speakers talking about, that was back in 2020, about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I discovered that was not something new to you. So you've been actually a champion in that space way before actually you joined Google, when you were still with your previous employer, that I'm also associated with. So it was really good to see that your involvement with DI goes back to, a number of years from now.
Yeah, look, no matter where I am, I'd love to be an ally for various causes, and particularly gender. It's one which I passionately get involved with. And I think, what's really great at Google, though, it's a company which doesn't need that much of a leg up. It's very much part of the culture of Google to be inclusive. Belonging is a huge theme here. So it's really nice to be an ally now, and an organization really does get it and understand it as well. And the importance of that and how that drives the ability for people to do really good work, because they don't have fear. They're not actually working in an environment where they're concerned about the way they're perceived or et cetera. And that's one of the nice things. And I think it actually influences very much the way we build. We'll get to that in a second, I'm sure, as well.
Yes, for sure. And before I hand over to my co-host, Martin, just want to touch on another thing that I found about you, Kirk, while preparing for this conversation, your passion for the outdoors and the fact, I know that the last time we spoke, you said I should remove this from my bio and my LinkedIn. I'm no longer, competing or training for triathlon, but it's something that sounds like it's linked to your passion for outdoor sustainability. So it's all interconnected, and I'm sure we'll find a link to Mindful AI and AI for Good. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Martin.
Yeah, I thought we could just start with a bit of a fairly open question, just about, I guess, what brought you to be working with AI at Google, and just if you want to share some of your background and journey and how you came to be in this position, being able to influence the course of AI on a daily basis at one of the main players in that space, Google.
Yeah, well, you give me opportunity to dig back a little bit, and my reason for being is all about mapping, and exploring. And that referred to the fact I love the outdoors. I'm privileged in living in Australia, of course, and growing up in Australia, I was very exposed to the outback, and at the time, using maps to explore and find your way. And so, at a very early age, I knew that mapping was a passion of mine, and I actually went on studied cartography, and I did that at a time which was interesting actually, because I actually learned in my first 2 years of a cartography degree at RMIT University. I actually learned to draw maps by hand using a scribe tip. It was very much still, I'm kind of dating myself now, but it was in the mid 80s, and it was actually fine for me because I wanted to build these maps or produce maps that you'd see typically in National Geographic or magazines of that ilk. And halfway through my degree, everything changed. It went digital. And so when I exited that, I was one of the first to come out with, the understanding of how to leverage mapping technology. And that's been at the forefront of my career the whole way through, working with the first navigation systems for car-based navigation systems and web mapping, mobile mapping, etc. And I think the key thing here is that maps, and particularly geospatial data, is very heavy, and it's always been leveraging technology. I wouldn't say generative AI, but AI was actually rule-based and narrow-based AI has been a huge part of building a map for many, many years. And so now working for Google and being able to leverage the tooling we have here, it's a theme which it's been pretty constant in my career, working closely with large companies who have ambitions to map the world at a very high fidelity. And AI now is a way which we can do that, not so much in building the map initially, but also maintaining that map, because that's the key is as you start to build and create these maps, which are basically what we call high definition maps, or maps which actually start to map the world down to centimeter level accuracy, things change a lot. And so being able to stay on top of that, it's impossible to do this without automation, and particularly in the kind of AI which we have at Google here.
And I guess a lot of there is some discussion now on the intelligence part when it comes to generative AI and potentially limitations in large language models, and people are starting to say that in order for AI to become truly intelligent and useful, it will need to have some kind of awareness of the actual world, and mapping of physical space is necessary for AI to progress from where we currently are. Do you agree with that assessment, or what's your view?
It's a bit of a layout there, Martin. I'm definitely not going to disagree. I think that Google, there's a couple of key principles which we build. And one of the ones, obviously, that people are very aware of is misinformation or hallucination. These engines are incredibly powerful, but unless they have the right data or context, and it's sometimes easy to be misguided about the results, etc. So this whole notion of called grounding, we call it grounding, and we actually just released a product recently about a month ago called Grounding with Google Maps. And it's the ability for these engines to be able to take all the geographic data we have, and that's tens of petabytes of data, whether it's every road, place name, boundary, administration areas, even imagery, because these are multimodal, of course, and enabling a query to have contextual information, and often that's grounded in spatial information about where you are, what potentially you're looking at. It's so critical, and so we definitely think a lot about that. This ability to ground, and hopefully, in terms of the physical real world application of this technology, reduce any kind of errors, because it's actually grounded on factual, authenticated data, which we do have. And then likewise for us to learn from that as well, because, we're able to leverage the prompts, the signals that come from that to just improve, make sure we have the best possible, most accurate data available there. Yeah, but it's really critical. Contextual referencing on that is such an important part of what happens there.
Yeah, and I when I was doing some research and looking at the work you're doing, and one thing I came across was it called plus codes or something like that, where you're helping slum residents in India to obtain physical addresses, so there's some really interesting and unexpected, I guess, applications of all of this. But so it seems like there's this connection between AI and mapping technology and basic human rights of infrastructure access. And I mean, there's so many interesting things that ties into this.
We actually approach it like that. It's definitely a human right to be able to have an address, have a location, because your identity is very much based around certain things, and being physically being able to actually receive, whether it be quick commerce, which is huge in India now, and particularly we've mapped pretty well the first 100 cities, but now getting into like the second or third tier cities where there's no address structure. Then how do you actually go ahead and basically this whole inclusion, be able to leverage technology to get a delivery to your address, or to have someone find your particular, you might be in a huge complex, and because these addresses don't exist, plus codes is one option we have there. But we're constantly thinking about ways to solve this problem. It's one which we work closely with partners on as well. We have a couple of big partners which we're trying to make sure that we can get it to the last meter, so to speak, get deliveries. But it's very difficult in these areas where you don't have a physical address. And so that's one of the first things we try to solve for.
Yeah. I guess, people aren't getting around on bikes either. In cars either. They're on bikes and walking around. So I guess there's like this micro mobility mapping that needs to happen as well in order to service that part of the world that is kind of somehow sometimes a bit left behind, it seems, with not just the AI revolution but the tech revolution in general.
One of the beautiful things about mapping, to do it at the scale we do with 200 plus countries, it's important, and classically Google way, to think about creating some kind of service or application which is basically ability to go across the world. But you have to be very local in mapping. You've raised two really good points there, the way that people live, but also how they get around in not just India, but Indonesia, a lot of these global south countries. Two-wheelers is the preferred mode of transportation. So understanding that the widths, the narrow road widths, etc. What's also interesting, that many people, they don't actually receive instructions about at 300 meters turn left. They're usually giving instructions based upon landmarks. And so it could be literally at the basically temple on the right hand corner, turn right behind the temple. So this ability to actually have landmark guidance is something we've been working towards as well, and actually now delivered as well, because really that's the way that people receive instructions there. It's not based upon knowing how far down the road. It's actually at a certain landmark and giving instructions based upon that. The two-wheeler is interesting too. One of the big things that this technology we often think about is hoping to reduce fatalities, and that's one of the big things in India at the moment, is this horrendous amount of, just like it is in most countries, the road fatality rate is quite high. So, often we don't think about the ability to use technology like this for safety, but it's a big driver of what we have. And at the moment, there's a lot of deliveries happening. You see these crazy images where there's phones hanging off a small Vespa or scooter, and it could be raining, and so it's almost impossible to see this screen. One of the things launched last year was the ability to actually using Android Automotive, which is an offering Google have, but we have a specific Android Automotive now for bikes, which is smaller screens, and so it can embed it now, the latest e-bikes, electric bikes, which is really going off in India. And so we can actually now, you don't actually have to have your phone hanging off and being mounted to the handlebars. It actually can be embedded within the display of that bike, which is a lot safer. It also has the ability to use Bluetooth technology, so it can actually have an earpiece in there. So it's actually one of the things where often to drive safety, to bring, just like we do in the Western world, where basically distractions and disruptions is really key. And so basically able to go and key. Same thing happens in emerging markets, but thinking about it from a two-wheeler perspective and getting maps onto the small screens of two-wheelers is something we're very focused on too.
I hope I'm not misquoting you, but I think you said something along the lines that Google just took another big step towards becoming the chat GPT for planet Earth, just regarding geospatial AI. So what excites you most about this democratization and commodification of geospatial AI capabilities, especially, I guess, in those parts of the world?
I think, it doesn't have to be those parts of the world, the emerging markets as well. One of the key things about mapping and geospatial data is you typically need, any organization who wants to solve some question which could use location or map information has typically had to have an engineer, a geospatial engineer, using very specialist software trained for that. And often that's very expensive as well. Like, you'll have a department with 3 or 4 geospatial engineers that can, whether it's an insurance company or any other company. What's happening over the last couple of years is, of course, vibe coding is now a real thing. And one of the things we're very excited about is the ability for someone to have natural language and be able to put in a prompt, which is going to help them to get a solution or an answer, which is leveraging geospatial data, which produces a map, which produces charts without actually having to have this engineering background. So we're very focused on what we call build with AI, which is really ability for you to, whether it's through vibe coding, whether you're an engineer working with what's called in IDEs, which is the integrated development environments, to be able to actually have embedded in there the geospatial data we've got in whatever language model you're using, and to use that in a way which you never could before in solving, it could be anything to do with, as I mentioned before, insurance. It could be a climate issue. One of the big things we're very passionate about is using this technology for driving a more sustainable planet. And so we're very keen to provide data sets to people. In fact, we have a product called Earth Engine, not to be confused with Google Earth. Basically, it's been around for about 15 years now, 15 plus years. It's got petabytes of data. It's got all this processing capability. And it's actually free for a lot of NGOs and for small organizations. But it's got a lot of information that allows you to make decisions about where resources can be best used. At the moment, whether it's sustainable sourcing, we do a lot of work now with organizations who need to know and trace back to the source, whether it's cocoa, other commodities, etc. And these data sets are all available pre-processed. So the grunt work that was in the past required is no longer there. In fact, we're actually putting this into Google Earth, which is a product which many people use to visualize. And that has actually got a professional version now. So people can now start to layer these data sets on top. And again, using a chat prompt, be able to then do queries on this and have solutions and results and analysis, which particularly was not possible before because you didn't have this kind of interface onto maps.
Yeah, I just Google just a few days ago came out with this amazingly competent image model, the Banana Pro, I guess is the name for it. But I was just thinking, it's this geospatial data. Will that be fed into something like that, so you can actually generate, just give a map prompt and have a accurate mapping of whatever you're want to visualize come out?
It's based on Gemini 3, which is our latest model, of course, and a lot of geospatial data went into the back of that. And so it'd be really interesting. Again, we've tested for certain use cases. I'm intrigued. The last couple of days I've seen some amazing things coming from this. It's one of those things with AI, you're never really quite certain exactly how people are going to use it. And just this morning, I was looking at someone who actually created a stylized map based upon a satellite image, which would have, again, someone like myself who's got cartographic skills, would have taken quite a few days to produce. And it's very exciting. It's really, really quite exciting where it's going.
Yeah, especially when these like emergent capabilities pop out that no one had expected. The models are doing things that we didn't predict, that it turns out to be quite amazing and surprisingly useful. I guess, this might be one of those use cases potentially.
Yeah, it's you've got these what we call maker use cases. It's all about people making or creating, and whether it's product or output from that, all the way through to ones which we heavily curate, of course, which is more like, the autonomous technology. If you think about a Waymo solution, which is, self-driving cars, which is another capability. It's using heavily geospatial data and maps and of course sensors and active sensors to be able to help self-drive. But, it's quite amazing. It's, two completely different use cases or scenarios about the use of maps through the different technologies we have.
So Matt, do you have,
I do have 200 questions or comments in my head right now. I think I will struggle to make some sense out of it. But just listening to Kirk, I guess a couple of things that were in my mind is one was the world. What's the world is a village? With this idea of mapping every single centimeter. It's a of course, big data. With my background in data analytics, the amount of data that you're dealing is just extraordinary. And before we switch gears to talk about, as we typically do in this here in the Mindful AI podcast, about the benefits of AI and the potential concerns and risks that our guests can envisage. You mentioned, Kirk, that halfway through uni, things change, and you're studying cartography and then move to digital. So having to cope with that change. And you teach, you've been teaching, although you're very, very busy. In your introduction, I think Martin would, when he connect the introduction to this recording, will probably share that you have worked, in Singapore, Germany, what else, Belgium as well. And because of my Belgian background, that called my attention, and you've been everywhere. And you still find time to teach, I think as a guest lecturer also, but, and reading one of your articles on LinkedIn, you spoke about Simon Sinek, and encouraging students to start with the why and think about the intent, So it makes me wonder, what Kirk's, intent, and I can see lots of points or touch points around AI for good in the last 10 minutes as I was listening to you, and probably that's evolving over time, since you were in your 20s until now. But if there is something that comes to mind, even with your move to to join Google 4 or 5 years ago, and how you see the role you play, given that this is the Mindful AI podcast, anything around intent or purpose or your why that you'd like to comment?
Interesting. I actually teach a subject at RMIT for final year students, and before it's called professional development. It's a series of 3 or 4 different lectures, and so I'm actually usually working with students who are about to actually basically finish their undergraduate and go out into the world. And it's actually really selfish, to be frank, because I'm keeping really abreast of what they're thinking, because I love the ideas, the thinking that's come through that. I think ultimately in technology, I've been in this for 30 years now, and I think, it's so important for me to be curious about how maps are completely differently be built today than they were 20, 30 years ago. And so it's a two-way thing for me. It's really nice when I spend time with students who are, not just digital natives, but actually AI-based natives. They're thinking from the start about how to build and maintain these maps using AI, which is really interesting. I do challenge them about thinking about their why, because I think ultimately maps can help a lot of different use cases, that's for sure. And back in the day when I started to work in mapping, it was a technology which wasn't widely adopted. And to be frank, through the 90s, if I spoke to someone, they asked me what I did, and I started talking about car navigation. It was something from James Bond. It was we're all paper maps. And one of the unique things about maps is that you have to get the edge cases really, really tuned down. This is the case. The actual margin of error is so small. Back then, it's what we call resolve a location. So you put an address in or a destination. We'd only get it right maybe 80, 90% of the time. We had this 10% error rate, which was quite acceptable in the 90s because it was quite new technology. Today, that would not be feasible. We really have got it to a point now where you expect the right result every time you put an address or a place into a navigation engine. And the fact that it's now widely adopted, it's quite amazing to see that it happened. But I think, back to the question, and I think it's really about intent. I try to really, be curious about what people are going to use this capability for. For me, over the last 4 or 5 years, in particular, since I've arrived at Google, the challenges we have around climate are huge. And I really feel this technology can be hugely important and beneficial for a lot of different reasons. One of the things at Google, we have an amazing research department, and they are solving a lot of the major challenges we have. One of the last 2 or 3 years, we had this thing called Project Greenlight, which looks at the movement data we have. Obviously, we're privileged and we have lots of users, and of course, we respect very much the trust we have those users. But things like traffic information, you get a benefit from that when you see how good the traffic information is. Like sometimes there's 10 or so cars in front of you, you'll see an orange or red line come from that. We could potentially aggregate that in a way which we do not at all disclose any individual's private information, of course, but we can take that and work with cities now, look at the traffic light sequencing, and because we know the movement of all modes of transport, particularly cars, through a major city, we can actually advise what the optimal traffic sequencing will be. We just did it with Boston, actually, and Boston got anywhere between 10 to 30% more efficient routes happening based upon the signaling we suggested. And we can see that immediately. The next day, we actually can tell what impact we've had on the flow of traffic. And that's, we've actually got a goal as a company to try to work with cities, partners, users to take a gigaton of emissions out of the atmosphere, which is put into perspective is about the emissions that Japan would have in a year, to try to actually reduce emissions by that amount. And Project Greenlight is just one great way of example how to do that. So we've now got that live in 27 cities, add all those different, efficiencies we're building there, and it really does have an impact in terms of the way that people drive and the emissions that are coming from vehicles before we get to electrification. The other thing we're doing just recently is flight contrails, and so we're airlines now, and we all get. I love travel. One of those things where I do get very guilty about the amount of miles I clock up, of course, and I don't think travel and air travel is going to go away anytime soon. So what can we do to work with the airline industry to make it more efficient? I'm not sure if you're aware, but when you see contrails, the temperature differential and that the contrail that comes to the back of a plane doesn't happen so much in the southern hemisphere, but in the northern hemisphere, you see in the morning, over Europe, it's crisscrossed with contrails everywhere. They actually form clouds at some point, and that can make a flight 20 to 30% more emissions coming from that flight when the contrails formed. And so the goal is to try to avoid that contrail happening. And you can do that by advising the flight or the plane which heights and to avoid these really cold areas where the temperature differential is high. So we're now working with airlines to use all the temperature information and the AI modeling we have to basically put a flight route together, which minimizes basically contrail. And the results so far, we've reduced the contrail creation by about 50%. So these are things which you add up over time. It's just amazing what happens in terms of the planet. So for me, you can see that's my why at the moment. It's really trying to use this technology, the power of AI for a more sustainable kind of planet. The other thing too, just recently to bring it back home to Australia, it's just not emissions reductions, but it's also nature. And we started the podcast of talking about how I love to explore and get out there and be active. And Australia is in a really interesting situation now where we have lots of different things impacting our country, whether it's fires, etc. But whether it's the reefs are being impacted or kelp by the temperatures in the water that are increasing. Around Tasmania now, we've lost 95% of these giant kelp forests, and kelp is incredibly important it's the lungs of the ocean. In fact, it really is important for oxygenation and reducing carbon. 95% of the kelps died over the last 4 or 5 years around Tasmania. So we're now basically mapping to figure out where those 5% of kelp still exist, and we're working with CSIRO, quite a few different other organizations to identify why the kelp that still exists, why they didn't die, what's potentially in the DNA there that is resistant to temperature, and then hopefully replenish and go back and to bring kelp back. And so programs like this, which is about climate resilience as much as it is emission reduction, but this is all based upon use of AI, which I think is a really positive way to use AI as opposed to some of the other potential fears and risks that are out there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's fascinating, Kirk. And I think we talked quite a bit about you built your whole career around geospatial, GIS, and clearly I think that's your life's work until now, at least, no? And that's your passion. Maybe if we step back and go a little bit broader, and you already covered a lot of ground in that theme of AI for good, and the benefits of opportunities that AI offer for benefits for humanity, very, very broadly speaking. And then after that, we'll flip into concerns or, any. And typically when we ask about AI benefits in general, we tend to ask guests about an organization they have as a role model that is actually doing really, really well, in role modeling AI for good or responsible adoption of AI. You spoke about adoption there before. Of course, Google is, as per the last 10, 15 minutes again, we have plenty of use cases of, employing AI for good, demonstrating that. But if you had any other organizations in mind, it would be great to hear as well. So just broadly speaking, AI for good, benefits for humanity, what comes to mind, Kirk? Very broad question.
Good for humanity?
Yes.
Yeah, so beyond what I've been talking about, which is more the sustainability side, I think, I talked a bit about very much around this vision zero, which is reducing fatalities. The other thing, I'm a very passionate cyclist, and so for me, when it comes to autonomous technology, I think for me it's a major reason why I love this capability, because ultimately, if you look at, for example, Waymo, and I'll talk about a risk actually. One of the downsides of Waymo. Let me talk about a benefit of Waymo. Is the 7 million miles that we've studied and now analyzed. I think it's about 6 to 7 times safer and then less accidents than a normal human driver. It is incredible about. It's one of those things where the perception, because a lot of people get very nervous about getting to autonomous vehicle. I don't know if you've both actually experienced Waymo experience if you're in the US now. If you go to San Francisco, Phoenix, Los Angeles, just been announced in New York. It's actually Tokyo is going to be one of the first countries outside. I talk to people often about what their experience is like when they went into it, and to be frank, half the people I talk to are quite fearful about this, this whole notion of a self-driving car. But the data's there. It's actually not only from the perspective of the convenience of being a rider in a autonomous vehicle, but it's more about the vulnerable road users, the cyclists in particular. They don't hit cyclists. They really are nailed that use case down. So Waymo, massive potential opportunity to, and I use the word disrupt here, the what it means to actually with transportation, about where that's going. The potential side, the second order of that, is really what it's going to do, maybe to the massive segment of the population who basically drives for work. Whether it's truck drivers, it's ride sharing companies, it's taxi drivers, it's anyone who's actually driving transportation, which I believe in most countries is around about 3 to 4% of the population. So often, I think about, this is phenomenal in terms of what the technology provides, but what's the impact that's going to happen on a big chunk of society, which really drives for a living, the professional drivers. So these are things which I think ultimately Google does think through this. I think it's a company which likes to think about that second order thinking, what's going to happen beyond that. And in some ways, I've bundle that benefit in with a risk at the same time. But that's some of the impact, I think, in terms when you have autonomous technology in particular, what it's going to mean for the livelihood of a good chunk of the population. That's something which is worthwhile considering. But for me, as a cyclist, I'm looking forward to the day when I can
don't have to get run over
safely.
where it's some workforce displacement.
Yeah.
And I guess it's technology has always changed the nature of the workforce, but we seem to be able to keep ourselves busy with new things. So I guess we'll see what happens. But that would be one of the unknowns so far, with the second order effects of AI for sure. I had one thing that just came into my mind, just interesting to hear your view on. So one of the things I am hoping for with AI is we live in a world of I guess you could say tribalism, where belonging is sometimes more important than truth. People don't always they tend to believe in things that might not be factual, or we talked about climate before, and that's such an obvious area. But my hope is that as these AI models get access to more and more data, they will be less likely to. It's going to be harder to pin them down into any of our perspectives, and potentially they will be able to provide us with less bias and less distortion, and thus enabling us to make better choices and live more wisely. But what's your take on that? Do you think that's a potential benefit of AI, that will see things more accurately and clearly?
Yeah, bias is something that Google thinks a lot about. It's interesting. In 2018, there was a AI principle published within the company, and I think it's open. But essentially, bias is one of the first things that Google's really trying to reduce in most of these foundational models, of course. But the point you're making there, Martin, is ultimately your perception of the world is your own perception of the world. Hopefully, tools which are, even though it's built upon data and it's learned, these inference engines, which is a lot broader than your own. And so it's actually, I think people are using it for that now. It's actually in a really nice way as a tool to be able to have a broader perspective, to be able to fact check, or at least give you an opinion which might be different to yours. And so I think it's a really great way to use this technology. It's really interesting. I've got 2 young boys, teenagers actually, and I often think about what's going to happen with them, how they're going to use this tool, because ultimately they do use these tools in everything they're about. And one of the things I get a little bit nervous about is and it was interesting because we'll get to books in a second. I know you asked me about 3 different books, but
Sure.
one I read a fair while ago now, it's almost 10 years. It came out in 2014. It's called The Second Machine Age. And it's a book which really looked at the opportunity around AI. And it was actually predating what was going to happen with, transformers and generative AI. But it actually, the first half of the book was explaining why we're in the second machine age now. First, of course, being the industrial revolution. But the second half of the book was about what are you going to educate kids? What are the people? What should we really train both children and also yourselves about? What are the most important things to be able to work with these tools? And it was all about abstraction thinking. I think it's the scientific thought process is so important for you to be considered and discerning about how you use these models, of course. Creativity, which I'm going to get to in a sec, because back then, there was no way we actually even dreamt that these engines could do and be as creative as they are today. So that's what I'm a bit nervous about. And of course, communication skills, the ability for you to be able to use these tools, but still we're always going to have to work in teams and to be able to work to drive towards common shared goals and to deliver and build products, etc. So they're the 3 things: communication, abstraction thinking, and creativity. But creativity is an interesting one, because what's amazing about these models is that they're getting really creative now. And why I get a bit nervous, the reason I'm starting to bring this up is that, yes, you could use it to help to maybe provide you different perspectives and to take some of the biases away. But people are now starting to use it for a lot of creativity, which I think is good. And Nat, you asked me, who do I look to in terms of organizations or people? I like to read pretty broadly, and I like to follow lots of different things. But there's actually Nick Cave. I'm not too sure if you've both heard of Nick Cave, but he's a musician from Melbourne, actually.
Yeah, Nick Cave.
He's an artist. He's many, many things. But he's actually, he was being asked a lot about AI, his thoughts on AI, particularly when it comes to creativity. And one of the things he actually wrote about a year ago, which I felt was really important, is that in most people's lives, and this is where you're getting back, Martin, particularly when you're a creator, the beauty of the creation is in the struggle of creating. Ultimately, whether it's a song, a poem, if it's a great product you're building, the whole process of actually having to work towards that, and that's not an easy process, of course. The thought of actually just pinging an engine now and then taking whatever that creative process or whatever it's come back to you without actually doing the work is something which is a world I'd not like to live in. I think ultimately Nick Hayes' point was that. In fact, he even just referenced the Bible, because he talked about the fact in the creation story, in the 7th day God rested, and he said he rested because he actually did a lot of work, and it was interesting the way he referenced that. But this really importance of hoping, I'm hoping that these engines don't take away creativity. I think it's really important for the human side of what we have, that the creation element is so key as a foundational part of this. I think we got a bit philosophical, then off track then, but yeah, thinking about this a lot, particularly the creative side. I'm just blown away with how creative these engines are. But at the same time, and particularly for when I look at my boys, and both of them love music and both are into lots of different things which require creativity, but they're starting to use these engines to help with that. And I don't outsource. I really think that part of it should always be, we should always struggle towards something and not hopefully use these engines and the creative side of things.
And I don't know if I should cite that because I can't recall the source, but we can check it out and put in the show notes later. A recent research showing, brain activity when we're creating with assistance and without assistance, and how much activity we have in different areas of the brain. Of course, we want to use, but just be mindful about how much. And we spoke about cognitive laziness before. I think that's the one extreme. But I think it's really, it's challenging to make the decision and how much we want to leverage, tools in the creative process.
Funny you say that, Nat. That's one of the things as a cartographer and mapper. So one of the downsides of this blue dot and the fact we're all reliant upon Google Maps, of course, or Waze, to navigate around the world and to find yourself, what's actually happening now is that particularly the younger generation, this whole notion of spatial awareness, it doesn't exist. People are now, it's a really key part of development, actually, spatial awareness. It really helps with your frame in your mind. I find that it's ironic that the technology I've been building is taking away that love for the map. That whole thing about when you look, you have to orientate yourself and then start to think about how you relate to that and where you're positioned in that. That unfortunately is technology is taking away. And similar to what you're saying there, that that this cognition that has to happen. It'd be a real shame that these tools are used for that. And I don't think I think in some ways we won't produce, amazing, like what we have been for centuries, where progress has happened. I think, that's one of the things we don't want to outsource that elements to. I think we should always be discerning. I said that word before. I think, you look at, again, the kids today, what do they talked a bit about the communication, the abstraction thinking, but the other one is to be able to ask really good questions and be discerning about that. The prompting is so key. And these are wonderful tools, but it's something where you need to put the design in the way you prompt it, and because ultimately that's going to dictate what you're going to get. And I see that now in schools. I think schools are starting to, both in the secondary level, but definitely tertiary, prompt engineering and prompting is something that's so important. But so asking the right questions in the right way, but then super, super important to be discerning about those results and to think about, take it for face value. Yeah.
Using a thinking partners, I guess, and I constantly have arguments with AI tools that I use, which I think is a good thing in such a way. But and that the whole human oversight, human in the loop, I guess, which is a very basic principle of responsible AI. But just back to your point before, the love for maps and the irony, right, that are now with digital maps. I saw you mentioning a quote, can't remember where now. You can use a quote from Einstein. I think you can use old maps to explore a new world, right? So it's, I think it's a great illustration of that. But I also believe that a friend of mine was telling me, Sami, Martin knows Sami, we had a conversation with Sami a while ago, a few years ago, and he was using this analogy of, microwave dinner and fine dining, how perhaps, how microwave dinner, it's probably a very bad analogy, but microwave dinner is to digital maps like fine dining is for handwritten, beautiful, almost like poetic, graphically elegant, design maps, you know what I mean? So I think that could elevate the status of the beautiful old school maps perhaps, but yeah.
I actually was at a conference about a month ago. It was actually at Mona, that amazing museum down Hobart. I don't know if you've both been.
Yeah, fantastic place.
And David Welsh, who came up with Mona, the concept, and that he actually is very happy to hear, passionate map lover, and just purchased a whole of old series maps. But he had this incredible 2 days. It was a part of the Australian New Zealand Mapping Society, and I went down and spoke, and in fact I had the keynote at the very end of the conference, and I'd had been sitting through 2 days of just talking about these amazing, beautiful old maps and the process and the exploration, how Tasmania was discovered, the Antarctic, all the exploration. But what was interesting coming through this story is that back in what's called the golden age of cartography, which is actually when these maps were so important for the way that at least Western Europe discovered the world and started to open up new trade routes, etc. Technology was so key then too, because at that time it was when the chronometer first came out. So people would set off on these sails and they could basically measure using getting latitude very well, but longitude's really hard to do without a really accurate clock, a chronometer. And it was just at that point when these amazing, really expensive chronometers were happening, which helped in the navigation. And then for the printing process, they discovered this high-end printing with copper plates, which allowed them to have really fine. So this was the first adoption of these new technologies. So technology and mapping has always been at the very edge, just like it is now. But I still have when I look at those beautiful handcrafted maps, to your point, that's definitely fine dining versus microwave. Sure.
I think also it's but when it comes to anything AI does, I think artificial intelligence in a sense is a bit of a misnomer, because it is not intelligent. It's simulating intelligence. It's not creative per se. It's simulating creativity, and maybe those two things will converge and be one. But I think there's certainly a place for I'm not sure that I could I don't see anything that AI has come up with that has been that kind of leaps and bounds, that creative spark that changes a field or comes up with a new type of math or a new art form. I mean, I'm certainly not seeing that. It's very, very clever statistical processing of the creativity that we put into it, and with some surprising outputs. But I think still there's definitely a room for human creativity, human intelligence, and even more so human intention, human caring, and so on, because those are not qualities of our transformers and large language models, at least not yet. So maybe hopefully these will be amazing tools for human creativity rather than the elimination of human creativity.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there is it's really, I think ultimately these are tools which the best of humanity can come from. I think in some ways we'll always figure out how to use technology in ways, and we've just seen that. The other thing that I really think about where we're placed is that, and again, but this whole analog versus digital, it's quite amazing. I think, what's fascinating is about music and how we would consume music. Ultimately, it's incredible where Spotify's taken that and the power of AI and the playlist generation that happens there. But, the whole experience of going back to some old technology and putting a piece of vinyl on, that's incredible how vinyls come back, and how you sit down and really, both sides of an album and consume that album as opposed to what you're doing through your playlist. It's fascinating how I think the human experience can be different also with these different technologies, which is really fascinating. But I know that's one of the things I wonder about too, how long these analog modes will stay around for, but we'll see. Yeah.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, and the next kind of two sections that typically we cover here, Kirk, around either one of those themes, AI ethics or AI regulation, human values, human rights, or technical aspects of AI. I think we touched on human rights somehow, and we spoke about sustainability quite a bit and how AI for good can be adopted and what Google has been doing already. So the next bit is around, we tend to ask our guests, what are the tips or the recommendations they will provide to those listeners, and being conscious that we have listeners who are AI professionals. We have data scientists, machine learning experts, people working in the field of AI, as well as lay people like AI consumers, because we are all AI consumers, right? So if you had any tip, any recommendation for people to produce AI more mindfully, and B, consume AI more mindfully, what comes to mind, if anything, from your perspective, Kirk?
I think it's a really good question, because ultimately we can all get sucked into reading the same books on the AI or podcasts, and there's a whole genre of things which are based around technology per se, and because there's so many now, you can consume your entire week by just listening to the same go-to podcasts or books, etc. But one of the things I feel really interesting is thinking more broadly about other people, whether it be artists. I mentioned Nick Cave before, who have a perspective on AI, and trying to seek those. One podcast I've been listening to for quite a few years, purely because he actually was an endurance athlete and kind of resonated with me when he first started. But it's become much more of a wellness podcast, and it's Rich Roll. I don't know if it is one of the biggest listened podcasts in the US in particular, but Rich Roll podcast. And over the last 4 or 5 years, he's been weaving in his thoughts on AI, and he has a lot of neuroscientists, and what I'm getting towards here is a different voice on what, he's someone who actually really, I think his goal in his podcast is to get people to think intentfully and really be conscious about the decisions they make and about where they're at. And that's obviously with the way they basically, in the wellness side, the longevity side is about how they conduct themselves, because everything really starts around that. If you can't have the ability to look after yourself, how can you do your family and your teams, etc.? So it starts from that perspective. But every 4 or 5 weeks, he has a podcast and talks about AI, and it's really interesting the framing he has there. And so my point is, I like to find outside of tech, different people who've got a perspective on AI and how that helps to guide the way I think about it. At least that's one thing. But Rich Roll podcast is definitely something I'd recommend. I think he's done over 1,000 podcasts now, so he's got a whole genre of material. But there's been quite a few when it comes to the way that AI could and should be used. The other one is someone who I used to work at a company called Here Technologies before Google, and that was actually owned by Nokia for a period of years. And so it was a fascinating time, actually. Nokia acquired what was called Navtech in 2007. So I joined and became part of Nokia through that acquisition. And so for the next 3 or 4 years, I watched, basically Nokia be challenged by Apple, of course, and what actually we all know very well what happened to the handset business at a certain point. But what blew me away about Nokia, and it was it's something that was really much around that period, of course, is about they had a chief design officer. So there was actually, design was a key element of the DNA of Nokia and the way they think and thought. And that happened a lot, actually, I think, during 2005 through about 2020. I see that happening a lot less now, but there's actually a gentleman who worked at the Nokia Design Lab, and I worked with a couple of really key designers, a guy called Peter Skillman, who's now, I think, one of the head of design for Philips, and Reese Newman is another person who is a good friend of mine, but he just recently read a book from Nick Foster, who was also at Nokia at the time, a designer. And he went on to work, he's worked with Dyson, he's worked with Nokia, he's actually worked with Google recently. He's kind of more a futurist now, and he just wrote a book this year called Could, Should, Might, Don't. And it's really intriguing because it was actually coming from, creating future technology or future capability, but from these 4 principles. And it's really amazing from him is often when we have a new technology, Google, many other companies out there, we're going to talk about the shining bright ways, like there's a Waymo capability, and you always think about the best of what that technology will provide. But what actually does occur is actually a little bit of a gray area. It's not so much always like that. It's how does the mundane, as your everyday mundane, get impacted by this technology? And I just read the book, and it's a phenomenal book because it really got me thinking about how this technology might impact the mundane, the everyday things we do. And rather than, as a futurist, he was always being asked to show these 4-minute videos, inspiring videos of what the technology could do. But, really thinking more about, what the actual everyday activities that people would do. And it was really interesting, I think, to help to bring that into the forefront of my thinking. The other thing he said was really interesting, and I don't think it was from him, but basically it was something along the lines: if you create a ship, you create the shipwreck. So this responsibility you have when you build AI capability, like, it is a ship we're building. We're building shipping, literally the word shipping, of course, when you build it out there, but you actually at the same time have a responsibility because you need to think about that shipwreck and what is the end of life. How does this technology basically either retire or what's going to happen there? But a fascinating book. And examples where it's not just within tech industry. So Nick Foster was a could, should, might, don't, how we should think about the future. And then the Rich Roll podcast to go-tos I typically have been listening and reading.
Fantastic.
We'll definitely put those in the show notes.
Yes, and I'm conscious of time. Probably need to run soon, Kirk. So we'll start to wrap up. So thank you so much. We always say, literally every single episode, we say the same thing. And with you, I would love to do another episode in a more philosophical side of AI. I was thinking about, you mentioned the words adoption and culture. I think I read somewhere in one of your articles. So I'd love to hear your perspective just based on what you just shared there, the impact on behaviors and mindset, So maybe, who knows, maybe we could do another episode focusing on that side of things, because it sounds like you have a lot to say as well, in the philosophical, existential side of AI.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much. It's been a wonderful time to catch up with you both, and maybe look forward to that next podcast in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. And hopefully there'll be a part 2. Who knows?
Awesome. Thanks.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
so much.